Hi, welcome back to Term 3, Series 3 of Lunch Orders, where we will be looking at artificial intelligence and the relationship between technology and people. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, for Matt and myself, and to invite you to take a second to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that you are joining us from today. I would like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and recognise that this always was, always will be Aboriginal land. My name's Bec Kavanagh. I'm a writer and academic and the host of this series. And before I introduce our first guest for Lunch Orders AI, Dr Matt Agnew, I would like to also just thank our education partner, VATE, the Victorian Association for the Teaching of English, who has been working hard to create the most exceptional teacher's notes for Series 1 and 2, and is no doubt hard at work creating them for Series 3. Now I'd like to welcome our special guest for today, Dr Matt Agnew. Dr Matt is more than a scientist and a self-confessed nerd. He's a communications powerhouse, making STEM fun and accessible for everyone. With myriad appearances across media channels and a social media profile with a wide and varied audience, Dr. Matt is a passionate and engaging scientist who has worn many hats. As an engineer, an astrophysicist, and an artificial intelligence expert, and has become a popular commenter on the latest happenings in the world of science. Dr. Matt has a doctorate in astrophysics and a master's in artificial intelligence, and is one of Australia's leading edutainers. He was born in Adelaide, me too, raised in Perth, and now lives in Melbourne with his dog, Pluto. Welcome, Dr. Matt.
Thank you, Bec.
Thank you for joining us.
No, pleasure.
So I'm going to hand over to you for our soapbox, and then we will have a chat.
Beautiful. Let's do it. So I'm going to just set the scene a bit about what is my book about and the sort of structure, what we walk through as we progress through the pages. So is my phone reading my mind? The real facts about artificial intelligence. First things first is we need to kind of understand some of the fundamentals. So when discussing artificial intelligence, the obvious first question is, what is artificial intelligence? To do that, we need to break it down into its separate parts. So what is intelligence and what is artificial? One of those is much easier to define than the other, but ultimately it allows us to contextualize what it is we're doing when we talk about artificial intelligence. The next thing to consider is it around us already? Is it already part of our everyday lives? And there's ways that you may already guess that it's involved in your life, but there's other ways that are a little more subtle. So there's examples like ChatGPT. Everyone's very aware about that and what it can and can't do. But there's subtle things like Netflix recommending movies and TV shows to you. These are powered by artificial intelligence algorithms. The next thing to consider when talking about the ethics of artificial intelligence is, of course, what are ethics? So we need to understand what they are. How do they differ to morals? How do they differ to laws? There's some subtle differences there, and it's important to lay those foundations to give us a nice fundamental springboard to launch off as we progress into the second part of the book. Here we then start talking about how these ethics apply to artificial intelligence, and we consider things like unintended bias, what is bias, and how that can influence artificial intelligence algorithms, and ultimately what that means for how they influence us. There's also the idea of AI being misused, something probably a little more obvious than something as subtle as bias, but AI can be misused. We've seen it misused already, and there's ways that it can continue to be misused in society. And we'll jump into that in terms of understanding where it's been done in the past and where it could be, where some weak spots could be going forwards. The next part is, of course, the impact on humans as AI becomes a bigger and bigger part of our lives. There's going to be things like being replaced. What do we do when AI is better at certain jobs? And do we need to reskill? What if we can't reskill because AI has covered all of the jobs? What are the jobs that are most likely to be replaced first? And what are the ones that are less likely or the last to be replaced? And why is that? Finally, we need to consider the AI control problem and roboethics. So how do we control AI? We're smarter than AI at the moment, but will that always be the case? And roboethics, as AI develops and becomes more intelligent, when do we need to start considering the ethics of AI itself? So these slides, all of the images in these slides I generated with AI. So I've already replaced some of my labour in creating these slides. And I also have a glowing endorsement about this book that I thought I should share to, again, give you some context. So bear with me a moment as I read this out. I recently had the pleasure of reading Is My Phone Reading My Mind? The True Facts About Artificial Intelligence. And I must say, it's a fantastic book for young readers aged 8 to 12. This book brilliantly tackles the complex world of artificial intelligence in a way that is both accessible and thoroughly entertaining. From the very first chapter, it engages readers with clear explanations of what AI is and how it fits into our everyday lives. The examples are relatable and easy to understand, making the technology feel less intimidating and more fascinating. Each chapter is thoughtfully crafted, encouraging readers to think deeply about the implications of AI in our society. Overall, Is My Phone Reading My Mind is an exceptional read that not only educates but also inspires curiosity and critical thinking. It's a must-read for any young person interested in the technology shaping our world. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it and highly recommend it to both kids and adults alike. This book is a true gem in the world of children's literature on technology and ethics. And that is a fantastic, glowing review that I received from ChatGPT. And with that, that's my soapbox.
Fantastic. Gosh, a lot of questions. And of course, I want to second ChatGPT's glowing review. I mean, I can't possibly improve on it. However, I would like to second it. It is a really great book.
It certainly lied a little bit because ChatGPT didn't read it, but I prompted it to provide me with a glowing review. So
I mean, does anybody need to read books these days? We can just get ChatGPT to summarise them for us.
That's it. Large language models just, do the work for us.
Exactly. We can cut out that work of engaging with ideas and creativity. Brilliant. We're done. Okay. No, I want to start with this question of, or trying to define in some way, our relationship with AI. So you talk about, in your soapbox, but also more at length in the book, what artificial intelligence is as distinct from human intelligence. And within this model, we see ourselves, I think, very much as like the creators or owners of this kind of technology. Is this an accurate representation of this relationship, or should we be bringing more complexity to that relationship?
I think certainly at the moment, yes, I think that is a good characterisation of the relationship. I think at the moment, we still can't even define particularly well what sentience is. We know we're sentient, we know a lot of living things are sentient, but in terms of understanding or being able to define that, we don't have a good way of doing so. And so there's still this gap in what we call AI and I guess sentience and even consciousness. And so at the moment, we very much have built these algorithms and we're very much in control. And I think that does accurately depict the relationship. I think as we advance the complexity of these algorithms and we start somehow solving some of these more nebulous ideas around sentience and consciousness, and we start creating general AI that's more, I guess, mimicking the way we consider intelligence of ourselves or even other animals, then I think there is a need to redefine the relationship in a similar way that I guess some very intelligent animals, we have a different relationship to ants, for example. So I guess the answer is yes and no. I think for now, yes, I think it's an accurate way to describe it. But I think as it grows and technology is developing obviously at an increasingly accelerating rate, and so when that does inevitably happen, we do need to rethink that, I think.
I mean, it's one of the big questions, isn't it? This idea of control and the loss of control and how quickly we might lose control. would we know if AI was lying to us? I'm just thinking about, sorry, I do want to come back to this idea of control, but I'm thinking about the example in your book of animal sentience and the example of the gorilla who steals something, eats something and blames it on...
Breaks the sink off. It was Coco
Right.
the gorilla, breaks
Yes.
the sink and blames its kitten companion.
I mean, like, this is wild from a gorilla to be like, no, the cat did it.
Yeah.
If that's kind of, if we look at a gorilla and go, wow, that is so human to lie, to try and shift the blame, would we know in AI if it was lying or shifting the blame?
I think at the moment, yes, because of, well, there's two parts here, I think. So firstly, the Turing test, which I touch on as well.
Do you want to just outline that for us?
So Turing test is the idea that if you were talking on a computer to something at the other end, you don't know what it is, and you could ask it questions and chat to it in whatever capacity, could you tell whether or not you're talking to an AI or a human? And something is considered to pass the Turing test if you basically guessed it to be human, but it was an AI more than 50% of the time. It's very, very rudimentary assessment. It's quite old. It was coined by Alan Turing, but it's still something as a bit of a litmus test, I think, and still reasonably applicable, certainly at the stage of AI we are at the moment. So I think firstly, ChatGPT often can pass that simple definition. You can talk to it, and oftentimes you think you're talking to someone because of how well structured the conversation can be and the context of it. And certainly their last version they brought out, the 4.0, has even more human elements to it. So when you're talking to that, yes, you, I think, could be tricked to not know if something's lying in the same way that if you're talking to a human, you don't necessarily know if it's lying.
Right.
But the way it lies, because it's still clever algorithms, it's the illusion of consciousness, the illusion of sentience, you would have to code in some way the ability to lie and
like the motivation, the trigger that leads to the lie.
Whether it's just a stochastic process where it's, rolls a dice, 1,000-sided dice, you roll a 7, that means lie, or, some kind of clever way to I guess, motivate it to lie. So I've kind of rambled here a little bit, but I think, you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell, but it's also wouldn't be lying of its own volition, I guess, because it's very much just driven by algorithms, and so you'd have to code it in, essentially.
So you describe AI as like the brain behind the robot, for example. So the robot is the technology, the AI is the brain behind that. At the moment, it seems like we're still the brains behind the brain, we hope.
Yeah.
Who are the big brains behind the AI brain?
So it's typically your big tech companies. So, I mean, obviously, OpenAI is certainly within the public discourse would be considered the world leader. And that's because they were one of the first to popularize a consumer level artificial intelligence tool in ChatGPT. But certainly all your usual big players, Microsoft, Google, Apple's got theirs. Some of them are integrating with ChatGPT, but they all have their own research departments. DeepMind, which is now owned by Google, and that was the one that created Deep Blue, which was the first chess-playing robot that beat a human. So it's kind of the usual suspects within the big tech world that I would say are ultimately certainly converting the research into products that are usable to, whether it's at an enterprise level or at a consumer level. Again, you can go the brains behind the brains behind the brains are the scientists that are in the research labs at the bleeding edge of artificial intelligence development and algorithm development and machine learning development and all of those things.
If we stop the logic just at the brains behind the brain, I mean, we know that even though I think there's this perception that AI is colder and more analytical because it doesn't succumb to, the heat of human emotions, there is still bias in AI, and that seems to come from those brains. How would you describe the motivations of those big companies in terms of how and why they create this technology?
So I would say at a fundamental level, their motivation is money driven.
Right.
It's like any enterprise. But I think the bias that turns up is it's essentially because you're training on real world data. You're training on data that humans have generated. The bias is essentially as a result of that data, which is a reflection of reality. So all of the systemic biases that already exist, they're going to show up in data, and it does over and over. There's been recorded cases of this happening. So any of things that are resulting from patriarchal structures, sexism, systemic racist issues. There's a really well-documented example of incarceration rates in America being disproportionately black people being disproportionately incarcerated,
And in Australia.
And they in America they had this algorithm that was developed where it assisted in judges in sentencing, and because it was trained on this data, essentially it did two things. One, if a black person was up for sentencing, they were given a much harsher sentence, even if they had very, very low, they may not even be a reoffender, it might be a first offence, they were still hit with a much harsher sentence. But the reverse was also true, that white people were getting lesser sentences, even if they had extensive reoffending records. And so I just highlighted that if you do not take into account bias, then you're essentially perpetuating these existing racist, sexist, insert whatever prejudice here.
Like we're embedding the worst of ourselves into our technology.
Correct, yeah. And
Terrible.
So big tech has a moral and ethical responsibility and potential illegal responsibility if things get regulated and legislated correctly to take into account these existing biases and adjust the data sets that the algorithms are trained on to better reflect a more equitable society.
And we were talking about, before we started recording, we were talking about really the inadequacy of the current speed that we're addressing these legal and ethical considerations. I don't really have a more specific question on that than just, what are your thoughts on this? Like, or maybe to be more specific, what would a good framework look like to you to be able to keep up with the ever-changing technology?
It's a tough one. I'm not sure exactly what it would look like. I think it needs to be incorporating input from the big tech developers, policymakers, and society as a whole. And it needs to, the current systems are, as you pointed out, way too slow. And we discussed earlier that I guess the last big tech development, certainly within the software space, was social media. That's been, I guess, kind of around for a decade or a bit more. Decade on, we still haven't correctly regulated and legislated that. There's still so many issues around that, and now we've just dropped another new tech on top of that. We're already behind in the last big development, so we're playing catch up twice as much now, and that's only going to get worse as it develops. So the current system for regulating and legislating is way too slow, and so I think there needs to be certainly a fundamental overhaul in how that's done. And I think whether or not that's some kind of additional branch of a regulatory body or a governing body that is specifically designed to act quickly and decisively around regulating and legislating these things. And there's things happening. The EU recently passed the first AI, I've forgotten the name specifically of it, but it's an AI Act to help start governing things within the EU. And so whatever they're doing is certainly a good starting place to say, all right, well, they've done this in a prompt fashion. What can we import from the system they used? But yeah, I think there needs to be a specific body that takes into account and has a responsibility placed on big tech, policymakers and society to have input in getting this done quickly and decisively.
And we're, of course, talking about the need to really include and engage a lot more young people who are working with and living with and growing up with this kind of shifting technology, and therefore a lot more savvy and a lot more familiar than a lot of the older policymakers and policy procedures as well. How can young people, especially teenagers, start to think about how they might get involved to have their voice heard in these spaces?
Very, very good question. I think getting involved in politics, it's not a fun thing to get involved with, obviously, but I think having young people engaged and involved, certainly in things that are going to impact them so much more than the generations before them. And so I think that extends very clearly to things like climate change. They're the ones who are going to inherit this problem and deal with the worst of it. But AI as well is an obvious one where currently the people who are making policy and regulating these things, I mean, they'll be part of, as AI becomes a bigger part of their lives, they'll certainly experience that, but not to the degree that the younger generation is. So I think you do need to kind of actively engage and highlight these issues. I guess, yeah, just kind of participate in that capacity. I think beyond that, certainly grassroots things always create attention. But I think it's probably engaging earlier in politics about things that are so significant in how much they pertain to their generation.
I feel like when we talk about AI, we often talk about how we can use it to be more efficient. You know, we can like palm off some of our work to get AI to do it faster or better or cheaper.
All these great images, right?
Yeah, that's right. Who would ever know?
Who would know?
Is AI a symptom of a society that values productivity over people? Or do you have a more optimistic perspective?
Yeah, I think there's probably a part of that. I think certainly productivity has driven a lot of technological development. I think I'd like to think optimistically we would have developed it regardless of, I guess, capitalist motivations. But it's hard to say. So yeah, potentially it is a symptom. I think the challenge with the improvements in productivity and efficiency is with every new piece of tech, I think there's been promises of working less because productivity goes up, and that doesn't seem to...
Never seems to happen.
That doesn't track.
Astonishingly, yeah.
So there's a concern, is that going to happen again? Is it just we'll see these enormous jumps and leaps in productivity and yet nothing changes as far as our lives go, and regaining some of our own free time back for... You know, I'd argue the important parts of life, nurturing relationships and spending time with loved ones and all those things that enrich our lives. So, yes, I think there's probably an element of it being a symptom, but I think there's an inherent, I'd say curiosity is kind of the quintessential human condition, right? It's something that drives so much of what we do, and you can go back to, you know, First Nations people 60, 70,000 years ago, and there's still astronomy, learning from the stars, creating stories to contextualise and understand where we belong and how things began. There's this curiosity about life and reality in the world around us that drives technological development. So I like to think that removing the capitalist element, we still would have eventually found our way to this point, but certainly capitalism was an accelerant.
Shockingly, it seems like capitalism is often a problem that we have to grapple with somehow. Where is your curiosity in AI? What fascinates you about it or excites you about it? Like, where are the, you know, glimmers of really thrilling, optimistic usage of this technology?
I think two of the things I get quite excited about. One is, as I said, you know, and it's the challenge of that productivity gain is reclaiming more of our own time back. And the 40-hour week is, you know, a relic of a different era. And with technology improving and gains in productivity, we should be able to kind of change that from a 40-hour week to, a 32-hour week or a 24-hour week, whatever that happens to be. And so I'm excited about what that looks like. What does a different work-life structure look like? What does making a living look like in a world where you don't need to work as much? How would you like to spend your time? What are the important things for you that would enrich your life, make you happy, you'd be content with? So that's one of the things I love about AI is how it could have this enormous impact on our lives outside of just robots serving you coffee or something. There's this kind of fundamental life-changing element to it. The other is things where there's already a shortage of people, and by creating, and this is something much further in the future, because to mimic the human element is going to be, I think, one of the hardest challenges as far as robotics and AI goes. But I use an example. One of my friends has a robotic startup, and they create this. They've got this robot that they take into elderly care facilities, and it's kind of like, you're not replacing humans, but it's like instead of having a dog, there's this robot, and they can interact with it and have conversations, and it creates this additional companionship that you also get from a dog, but this is a dog that can talk to you kind of thing. And there's still an enormous chasm between a robot that's very clearly a robot, hasn't got the same warmth or empathy. All those really human qualities are still missing, but we'll get there, I think. And so I'm excited about the idea of making loneliness and feelings of being alone kind of no longer a problem. There's always, however you've ended up in a scenario or a set of circumstances where you can feel isolated, there's a way that we can address that immediately if there's a lack of human companionship that we can't find for someone. So it sounds kind of, I think, like a grim reality or a grim prediction, but I like to think it's a really positive one where we can eventually mimic the human experience in a way that we can make sure that people don't feel alone. Because I think loneliness is such a insidious feeling and something that is pervasive more so than ever on the other side of the pandemic, and just being able to do everything via your phone, really.
I mean, the American Surgeon General released some reports earlier this year about the pandemic of loneliness and its impacts on physiological health, and it's pretty alarming reading. I mean, I feel excited about that too, about the opportunities for AI in care, but there's also this little alarm bell in me that's like, it can be used to help and support care, but it shouldn't be used instead of human connection. You know, we can't replace human connection with even very advanced humanoid robots, surely.
Yes, no, and I think that's the key takeaways. It's got to be seen as something that augments this in the same way that you wouldn't replace the human element with a dog. But if you had a human element and this human-like robot to offer additional companionship, that's a good scenario. But a straight substitution, I think the last jobs that will be replaced are the ones where the human element is so critical to it, and that's teaching. I think there's something very important to the teaching and learning process, that being human is a requirement, and then obviously care. And I think we'll get to a point where certainly there'll be this companionship, but I think that it can't replace it unless it got to a point where it was indistinguishable. You were talking to me and I could be a robot and you wouldn't know. Until we get to something like that, it can't replace it, because if you're in need of care, the idea of a robot being the support is it's a future I don't like to think about.
Right.
But one where there's, say, a nurse or a doctor assisting you, and there's this additional companion providing you additional comfort, augmenting that human care. I think that's a good application, a really good application of it. in the same way, yeah, like a support dog. It's not replacing, it's adding additional assistance.
Yeah. So it seems like so much of where we go next with artificial intelligence is less reliant on our perspective as owners or creators and more reliant on us seeing ourselves as teachers of this, you know, infant-ish teenage technology. So with that in mind, what should we be teaching AI? Like, what do you think the three kind of fundamental things that you would want this baby robot to learn to be able to offer that kind of optimistic, compassionate future for AI?
Very good question. Very, very philosophical. I think what we touched on earlier about the bias, I think one of the key things we need to introduce is ensuring that it's trained on data that is equitable, that has a degree of intersectionality, that it is representative of all people and not just the big tech companies or those with the money or those with the power, anything that perpetuates existing power structures. So that, I think, is probably potentially the most important thing to teach it. I think beyond that, it starts getting into more futuristic sci-fi kind of ideas, but let's entertain this. I think,
good. Thank you.
I think probably then a curiosity. I think curiosity can be a very big or the biggest driving motivation for it to continue to learn and grow and understand the world around us, around it. And I think the other one would be some element of that human connection, whether that's empathy or crudely love or companionship or inclusion, or I'm not sure what the specific trait would be, but something that breaks down the barrier of the cold, soulless robot. And I think those three things would work to create something that is fair and just and equitable, something that is keen to learn and teach itself or learn from others about the world around it, and also can do so in a human way that bridges that gap between machine and human. And so it's something that can continue to grow towards that companionship idea.
Fascinating. We have unfortunately come to the end of our lunch order, even though I have a lot more questions, and hopefully everybody watching has many questions that they can continue to chat about. And to facilitate that, you are going to leave us with a question.
Yes. So, and we spoke about this a little bit, but with the improvements in productivity and the gains in efficiency, and ideally being able to unburden ourselves of some of the traditional working hours and working structures, with that new time that you have, how would you reimagine what making a living means, and how would you reimagine the paradigm of work-life balance and life, really, with the gains that we can get from developing AI to a point of removing some of that burden of labour?
Thank you so much. You've all got lots to think about. I'll look forward to seeing you at the next lunch order. Thank you so much for joining us, Matt.
Thanks for having me, Bec.
Thanks.